Well, I'm joined on the phone now by Stephen Bucci. He is the visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's a foreign and national security policy expert, and I'm grateful to have you on the show today, Steve. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's always good having folks from Heritage on to elaborate and to give some depth to some of these issues that we're facing today. And we want to talk about Iran today. And of course, President Trump recently backed out, I guess you could say, of the Iranian deal, or announced his intentions to do so. But before we get to that, I'd like to have you explain a little bit to our audience, to our listeners, what your background is and how you have a rather unique perspective and knowledge, I guess, on the region.
Okay. I spent nearly 28 years, or just over 28 years, in the United States Army. All but the first 2 years, I was in an Army Green Beret. So I was a Special Forces officer. My last 4 years on active duty, I was the military assistant to Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and then became a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense. So I'm pretty well versed on the terrorist threats that are out there, or the things that we've been doing since 2001, and all of the actions that we utilize across the government to protect the people and the interests of the United States of America.
So explain to the listeners why this idea, why this concept of Iran having nuclear weapons is unacceptable to the United States, to Israel, and to our allies in the region. Because as you well know, and I'm sure you've come across this in your conversations or debates and so forth, but a lot of folks will say, well, the United States has nuclear weapons. Why can't Iran? Or why can this country have weapons, nuclear weapons, and Iran cannot? Explain, I guess, the danger or the threat associated with that.
Well, the main thing is that the United States, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking of Israel having nuclear weapons, isn't threatening anybody. The Iranians, on a pretty regular basis, announce with no shame, no hiding, no dissembling at all, that they want to destroy America, they want to destroy Israel, and they take actions to develop the capability to do that. They don't make any pretense that these weapons are just for defense or just to deter somebody else. They're there because they have ideological designs on removing the two countries that they consider the great Satan and the lesser Satan from the face of the earth. So if someone is telling you they're going to come up and shoot you in the head, you really don't want them to have a gun. And in this case, the gun that they're looking for are nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles.
You're right. Exactly right. And it's not just the threats, which you illustrate, they do that. I mean, we've all heard the death to America chants, death to Israel, oftentimes even being overseen or led by these leaders in Iran. What are some other actions the Iranians have taken to show us that they are not to be trusted, or that they are, in fact, a legitimate, state sponsor of terror, this rogue state, this threat in the region? What are some other things outside of their stated intentions for nuclear weapons that they've done or been involved with that would raise concern?
Well, as far as the United States, all through our fighting in Iraq, the Iranians were supplying weapons to many of the Shia militias who are, kindred confession with the Iranians, who are also Shia Muslims, provided them with anti-vehicular weapons, provided them with improvised explosive devices that were specifically designed to penetrate our armored vehicles and do damage to Americans. So they were, it wasn't just a few things slipping across the border. I mean, they were actively training and providing weapons specifically designed to kill Americans. Beyond that, they're kind of all over the region. They run the terrorist group Hezbollah as a proxy. They use them the way the old Soviet Union used the Cubans in Africa, where if they have somebody they want to go after, they turn Hezbollah loose on them. They also have been, they're the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have actors from the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, that's sort of their Spetsnaz actors all over the world, in Latin America, all over the Middle East, in Africa, all conducting terrorist operations on a pretty regular basis. In fact, the majority of the money that was turned over to the Iranians when the deal was signed by President Obama, the $150 billion in funds that were frozen before and were released to them, and then that famous cargo plane full of cash loaded up on pallets and wrapped in saran wrap, almost all of it went to support those terrorist activities around the globe, and some to do their ballistic missile research and development. And then the final thing is they're one of the biggest supporters of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and have made the Syrian civil war extremely more dangerous and deadly than it would have been if they had stayed in their own country and not gotten involved in this other country's civil war.
So I've heard before, and I forget, I don't have it in front of me. You're in listening to you speak there, I'm reminded of something I had read or heard. I think it was a general, perhaps, that came out a year or so ago, saying that since 9/11, the nation, the country responsible for most U.S. deaths, soldiers, and so forth, is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Is that an accurate depiction?
It is, because they provide the weapons and the advisors to the Shia militias in Iraq. So, most of those guys would not have been killed or severely wounded, traumatic amputations of limbs, that sort of thing, if those militias had not had the weaponry and hardware given to them by the Iranians. They would not have been hurt. They also provide some of that stuff to certain groups in Afghanistan as well, and are supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen against Saudi Arabia, which is one of our allies. They're kind of all over the place doing bad things. So it's they're not just kindly old guys with big beards who just happen to have a different religious view than us. They're actively trying to kill either our folks or people that are allied with us.
And it's listening to you summarize it like that, it's incomprehensible, I think, for the average American, I'm in Indianapolis, the average Midwesterner, to hear that, this is the nation that we've recently struck up this Iran deal with, given all those factors, and I'm sure there's lots of other things that we just don't have time to get into, but summarize for our listeners, and I hear this a lot, I'm sure you do too, that this Iran deal really wasn't as bad as what we're led to believe. So just summarize what it is in particular that made this deal so bad, and maybe, and then we'll get into the reasons or that whether or not Trump should have done what he did and what happens next in a moment. But just summarize the overall context of the agreement and why it was such a bad deal to begin with.
Well, for me, being a Green Beret, I tend to look down at the ground level effects of this stuff. And because there was no prohibitions on Iran continuing to support terrorism around the world, to be able to use all the funds that we gave them for the support of those activities, there was no restrictions on their development of ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles, which, by the way, aren't really good for anything other than delivering weapons of mass destruction. They're kind of expensive if all you're going to shoot on them is standard, explosive warheads, and you're darn sure not going to deliver pistachios and carpets with them. So the only reason to have them is to deliver weapons of mass destruction, either chemical, biological, or if they get them eventually nuclear. So many of us said, how could you not incorporate that into the deal? And the Obama administration's answer was, well, this was just about the nuke stuff. Those other things are not covered in this agreement. We said, yes, you're right, and that's nutty. Why would you not have put that into the agreement when you had the Iranians at the table and had them looking for some sort of deal to take the economic pressure off them? You had the chance to really push that. Another thing that it didn't cover was the release of Americans that they're holding in Iran. All of that was left out. And frankly, the Iranians, as we know now, looking at the intelligence that the Israelis released last week, that, the Iranians are continuing their nuclear research and development. They're just doing it in facilities that they don't let the inspectors go to. Because the deal also said, this idea that we have free and unfettered access to their facilities is a complete lie. The inspectors ask to go places at certain times, and the Iranians come back not with a counteroffer, but with what they're really going to do. They say, no, you'll come here on Tuesday and you'll go to this facility. We're not letting you into those other ones you want to go to on Monday. I'm sure some people think, well, maybe they're just being testy, but no, they're hiding what they're doing. And then the final thing is, so many of these people have said, well, but, this shows that if America makes a deal that you can't depend on them to stick to it. Well, no, if the president wanted this deal to stick, President Obama, he should have submitted it as a treaty to the Senate and got the Senate to ratify it that way. And then the successors to President Obama would not really had the ability to change it the way President Trump just did. But President Obama knew he was not going to be able to do that. He did not have the support for it. And his advisor, Mr. Rhodes, Ben Rhodes, even admitted in a piece for the New York Times that he said, well, of course we had to lie about the Iran deal. It wouldn't have gotten through if we hadn't lied.
It's incredible.
So it's, all those things add up to President Trump looking at this deal. He said as a candidate he wanted to get rid of it. He gave it over a year to allow the State Department to try and get it modified. He listened to all of our allies make the argument for why they wanted to keep it, allowed them time to try and get it modified. And now he's saying, enough's enough. We're done. We're out of here. And we're going to put at least the U.S. unilateral sanctions back onto Iran. And there'll be collateral sanctions if anybody else helps Iran violate those things. And we'll go forward from here.
I'm glad to hear you say, it's something I harped on yesterday's show, was the fact that this was not considered a treaty. You're exactly right. This was the exact opposite happened in the Senate as to what should have happened, because, the Senate needs to have a 2/3 majority vote to approve and to ratify a treaty. And by the way that they allowed Obama and by extension John Kerry to negotiate this deal, and all this, they actually had the inverse to where 67 people had to stand up and say no, if they even got to that point in the process, to overturn a possible veto from Obama on his own treaty, or not treaty, but his own executive action, which is completely backwards. And so we have a senator here, Joe Donnelly, Democrat, was one of the 42 that voted to essentially filibuster the debate on the Iran deal. And we're going to make sure that we hold him accountable. In fact, we have a little parody song that we call Jihadi Joe. And I think it's accurate. These folks have enabled a jihadist regime to have a pathway to nuclear weapons. And it's candidly inexcusable. So I'm glad to hear you say that. But anyway, can you stick around? I'm going to take a quick break here, Steve. If you can stick around and join us for the next segment to continue this conversation. Is that okay?
Sure thing.
Perfect. I'm going to stop and take a break. You're listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Back in just a minute. So I'm joined on the phone by Steve Bucci of the Heritage Foundation. Steve and I have been talking about Iran. Steve has a lot of experience and knowledge pertaining to Iran, the dangers of Iran, and we've been talking about the Iran deal in particular. One of the things, Steve, that's interesting to me is, we're talking about the starting point is this Iran nuke deal, right? That Iran apparently needs nuclear something. And it's interesting to me that they've always insisted that they wanted the nuclear technology for power plants and research. And of course, if that was the case, in my opinion, we would have been better off giving them $150 billion for windmills and solar panels, right? Which is all we can use here, apparently. So it's a crazy, silly narrative that we're chasing and following, built on faulty premises and so forth. So I don't think Americans fully grasp just how much that they hate us, that they hate Israel, and how they constantly act provocatively just in that region and elsewhere. And I know that we've kind of hit on some of those examples, but in light of all this stuff going on and in light of what's happening in North Korea, was the Obama deal not with Iran not similar to the path we're on with North Korea? It seems from someone standing back like myself that there's a lot of similarities between the Iran deal and where we found ourselves with North Korea. Is that accurate? And if so, how or what are the differences there?
Well, there was a very strong sanctions regime on Iran, an international one. That was probably one of the most well-enforced sanctions setups that we've ever had. It had the effect we wanted. It was affecting their economy and creating pressure domestically, and they came to the table. They wanted to make a deal. Perfect situation for the United States and our allies to make demands on Iran, to change their behavior, to change what they were doing, to only accept a deal that really allowed us to go in and investigate and check whether they were compliant or not. Instead, the Obama administration was so intent on getting everybody's name on a piece of paper that they repeatedly gave in to demands of the Iranians, who were the ones who came with their hat in their hand, and kept making more and more concessions, allowing them to have more and more control over the process, to the point where the deal no longer was in the interests of the United States. Now, you're right. As you look at what's happening with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, we put pressure on them. They have now come to the table. And if President Obama was still in office, my guess is we'd be in danger of coming up with a deal similar to the one we ended up with the Iranians, but he's not. John Kerry and Mike Pompeo couldn't be more different as secretaries of state as far as their negotiating skills and their intestinal fortitude. And I'm pretty confident that if we have a deal with North Korea, and there's no guarantee that we will. Kim Jong-un's a pretty slippery character, and he could take this in a whole different direction if he wants to. But if he does that, he's not going to get a deal, not out of this president and not out of this Secretary of State. If we get a deal, I think it'll be one that will hold their feet to the fire and hopefully will protect the interests of the United States, our people, and our allies in a way that hopefully brings some meaningful change to the Korean Peninsula, because Lord knows those poor people there in North Korea really need it.
It just seems to me, and again, I'm comparing the Clinton years where we were so intent, like you said, to get that signed piece of paper, and I also add in there a couple pinky promises, right? We think that we can suddenly negotiate with these dictators, right? These fanatical dictators, just because there's a signed sheet of paper. We negotiate from a position of weakness. The media and the Democrats provide us with a false choice, which was either you sign this piece of paper with this Iran deal or it's World War III, as though there's no other possible alternative in the entire universe. I feel like where we were in the 1990s with Clinton and that original North Korean agreement is similar to where Obama took us. I'm not talking about Trump's response to either. It just seems to me that history is repeating itself and no one is taking time to notice. And it takes leadership like Trump to be strong, to be definitive. The peace through strength strength kind of positioning to deal with these guys. Is that accurate?
It is. Look, nobody likes war. I mean, I was a soldier for most of my adult life, and war is a pretty miserable activity. You can die, people you love can die, just other parts of the human race are killed and damaged. It's bad, but there are things that are worse. And while I admire the desire to have peace, peace at all costs, we've shown over and over again through history, is not acceptable. The peace through strength that President Reagan championed and now President Trump is trying to implement, it brought the North Koreans to the table. And I think people need to remember that this step that he just took with Iran is not just there for the Iranians. Mm-hmm. It was also a message to the North Koreans that, hey, we want to cut a deal with you, pal. We want to see change in North Korea. We even want to help you develop, but not at all costs. And if the deal is bad, we're going to walk away. So don't play any games here. Mm-hmm. And I think, in the long run, that may end up being an even more important aspect of this, of yesterday's announcement than even our dealings with the Iranians, though. Mm-hmm. I think eventually the Iranians are going to show some movement as well.
So these things are all connected, right? I mean, these leaders, while they might act crazy sometimes, I mean, they're no idiots, right? They learn from the situation. What do you think they've learned about dealing with Trump versus dealing with Obama? What do you think that these world leaders, especially those that are our foes or those that threaten us and the rest of the world and so forth, what do you think they've learned as, what do you think they think about Donald Trump and the way that he approaches these sorts of issues?
I think they're a lot more, they recognize what he's doing. The leadership through strength aspect is kind of what they do. Most of these regimes are populated by bullies, and they'll bluster and bluff and huff and puff and threaten. And if you don't back down, they eventually come to the table. And, even with the Iranians, they said, okay, well, the Americans are pulling out, but, we're going to talk to the Europeans and we'll renegotiate with them, and we don't need the Americans at the table. Well, that's fine. They just want to see a better deal come out of it. I mean, we want to see a better deal come out of it. And eventually they're going to have to talk to us if they want to see our sanctions come off. And given their economic straits and their internal issues with their own population, because they didn't spend any of that money on their people, they spent it all on their terrorist buddies. Mm-hmm. I think you will see the Iranians start to move once they realize that all the bluffing and the huffing and puffing and President Obama tweeting and John Kerry coming over to chat with his old buds mm-hmm. isn't going to have any effect on President Trump's policies, that they'll start to make adjustments, and I think we'll see some progress.
I think at the very least, and I try to think about this from the perspective of people. I know people hate Trump for whatever reasons, those on the left and even some that are not politically that far to the left. But I think Trump, I think you would agree with this, at least deserves, in light of what's happened with North Korea, he at least deserves an opportunity to do something here, because it's pretty remarkable what's happened in North Korea. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a potentially, I'm not ready to declare victory yet,
sure.
But it has the potential to be a pretty darn historic bit of progress in an area that's, the war is over. They signed an armistice. That's pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, signed it, ended the war. So it's not just an armistice anymore. And, looks like they're saying they want to come to the table to talk about, getting rid of the nukes on the peninsula. We'll see. I mean, it'd be really nice to see that happen. We'll wait and see what they really say at the table. But, yeah, I'm with you. They should at least give the president the opportunity to sit down and see what he comes up with before you condemn him. Remember, mm-hmm. the people that are condemning him now that are saying, this is stupid, he shouldn't talk to him, were the same ones that a couple of weeks ago were saying, my God, if Trump doesn't talk to Kim Jong-un, he's going to cause World War III.
Yeah.
well, no World War III yet, and now Kim Jong-un's coming to the table. Let's see what Mr. Trump can come up with.
It's definitely interesting. I know we're short on time. One last thing I want to know. Let's say you're sitting at the table with Trump, you're serving as an advisor. What would you advise him to do at this particular point in time with Iran? What advice would you have for him?
I would say, Mr. President, I think your decision to get out of the agreement was 100% right. We need to now slap those unilateral sanctions on hard as quickly as we can. We need to be in close contact with our European allies so that we don't, screw them over, but so that they understand that we're not just going to give this a wink and a nod. We also need to tie into our Middle Eastern allies, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Gulf, other Gulf states who are thrilled with this development, and make sure that we stay tied to the hip with them. And going forward, we can possibly get this terrible regime in Iran to move and be more of a responsible actor.
Mm-hmm. I know I said that you said something that reminded me of something else I wanted to ask you really quickly, but what is going on with Israel is obviously very concerned with Iran, and we've touched on this a little bit. Israel is on very high alert. They're worried about the Iranian forces in Syria. I don't think a lot of Americans, we have a grasp on how tight and small that region is. And when they're in Damascus, that's not very far at all from being in the nation of Israel. What's going on there? What's the cause for concern? What's really brewing between the Israelis and the Iranians? And I guess what needs to be done there?
Well, as we stated right at the beginning, the Iranians make no bones about the fact that they want to not just, cause difficulty to the Israelis. They want to wipe them off the face of the earth. Mm-hmm. They have stated that categorically without any sort of softening at all. Because of the civil war in Syria, they have moved a lot of their forces, a lot of weapons capabilities into Syria, nominally to assist in fighting the rebels, but a whole bunch of them are down on the border with Israel, and Israel has stated they will not accept any sort of permanent military capability for the Iranians on their border. And if the Iranians and the Syrians try and develop such a capability, Israel reserves the right to take action, and they have several times. And I think they will continue to. I always kind of laugh when we talk about, Israel's on high alert. Israel's always on high alert. They're in a really bad neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And, the Syrians under Assad kind of let them alone because the Israelis pretty badly spanked Bashir al-Assad's dad, several times, in fact. But the Iranians coming in, having more and more control over that regime, have been in there and doing some pretty nefarious things. So, again, as I mentioned on an interview earlier today, the Iranians can poke the bear if they want, but they may find out that when you poke the bear, sometimes you not only lose the stick, but you lose your hand as well. Mm-hmm. So if they were wise, they can keep talking trash, but I don't think they'll do too much, because if they do, Israel will respond and respond robustly.
And from Israel's perspective, you've got a nation that's promised to wipe you off the face of the planet. They're tiptoeing up to your doorstep. They're building a military presence there. And so they have based on all of the things the Iranians have done that you hit on earlier, there's no trust whatsoever there. So it's a very precarious situation for Israel to find itself in.
Absolutely. And, back when President Obama, basically tried to silence Benjamin Netanyahu when he was speaking out against the agreement, because, President Obama thought his legacy was more important than the safety of Israel, apparently, and thought he understood Iran and the Middle East better than Benjamin Netanyahu does. I'm sorry, Netanyahu has been right all along, and President Obama, with all due respect to the former president, has been dead wrong. So, Israel's prime minister was not elected by his people to take orders from the President of the United States or to do what America says is in the interest of Israel. It's to do what he believes is in the interest of the Israeli people and the Israeli nation.
Absolutely.
And that's what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing.
Well, very good. Steve, I appreciate you're being gracious for staying a little bit longer. Sorry I got a little long-winded there, but this fascinates me. So I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
That's Steve Bucci with the Heritage Foundation talking about Iran. Got to stop and take a break. You're listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be back in just a minute.